Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Oman Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, going through the round 27 trade targets and preview. Unfortunately, wasn't able to do a live stream. Unbelievably, my internet issues were getting worse and worse, so I thought let's not even bother with a live stream. It just could be very frustrating. We'll do a recorded video, just go through kind of some of my thoughts for the week. Best pods, captaincy, best final week trade-ins. But congrats as well to anyone who won their head-to-head, and best of luck to those who are in the hunt still for overall rank glory. I'm definitely not in that situation. Rank of 3,153. I've just been stuck at this 3,000 spot for the last few weeks, and it's been a few decisions that I've been 50-50 on each week that have really cost me. Like last week, I sat Dillbags, which you guys would have heard about already. Cost me like 120, 130 points. That could have really been the week last week to really push into like the 2,500 and maybe get a crack at a rank starting with number one. I don't think that's really possible, but remains to be seen. I think the goal at the moment is let's just try to crack into this top 3,000. I've got one trade, I've got 45k in the bank, so I've got the flexibility to make a last week trade in and hope it works out for me. The team depth is looking pretty good though, so I don't need the trade necessarily, but I've got it. I'm going to have to use it. There's no way I can probably end the season with having one trade in the bank, but that's currently what the situation is with my team and rank-wise. And yeah, as I said, I'm going to keep this free-flowing, probably not going to be editing too much of it, I reckon, unless I make some serious stuff-ups, but we'll kind of go through my team, matchups, all that kind of good stuff. So I think before going through like players specifically, wanted to focus, I guess, on the matchups for the week, because I think the big question that people are going to be looking at both with their 1 week trade-ins and also sit starts is like, what are the matchups that you can really be targeting this week to give yourself that advantage? If you're on my position where you've got a trade to use or purely just deciding sit starts. And so I think obviously we need to look at the ladder to an extent to be able to determine this. So I've got the ladder up. Hopefully that actually works for you guys who are watching this. So obviously a lot to play for this week coming into the final round of the regular season. Melbourne Storm, there's no change to what happens with them. So they could lose this week, they could win this week, and they're going to be the minor premiers. With the Roosters picking up that injury list from last week with Sam Walker, etc. Penrith having the Titans this week on 38 points. Even if the Roosters do win, they do have a better differential, but you'd expect Penrith to also win. So I think we can probably expect going into this week that Penrith and the Roosters will stay where they are. Same with the Sharks. So they're sitting on 36 points as well. Although, say if the Roosters lose and Sharks win, then they could leapfrog the Roosters. You don't probably think any of those teams are going to drop out of the top four, that's for sure. The Sharks could potentially just maybe move up into third and fourth, but likelihood is probably if the matchups play out as we expect, the top four will probably remain unchanged and in this order. More things probably happen a little bit towards the bottom half of the 8. So Bulldogs are playing the Cowboys this week. So obviously a lot to play for there, wanting to get that home final, whoever finishes in 5th or 6th. So Bulldogs and Cowboys, I think, could be a game where maybe it's a bit cagey, not too many points, but obviously a lot on the line there. Sharks versus Manly, 2 teams in the top 8. They're playing for their respective positions as well to secure themselves in the 8. Dolphins versus Knights, 2 teams both on 28 points. Look, I think there would be points in that particular game just because both teams' defense probably isn't really their strong suit. Knights scored 36 points on the weekend. Dolphins put 40 on the Broncos, although they only conceded 6 points. But I think you can probably say both teams really good attacks. Defense-wise, maybe not the best. So you could see a game where, even though there's a lot on the line to play for, their natural instinct, I think, is to score points. So that's definitely a game I'm looking at where, while there's a lot on the line for that game, I think you can confidently pick players like a Kalen Ponga. If you want to go for a pod from the Dolphins, like a Hamiso, Herbie Farnworth, who absolutely killed it last week. I still feel like this matchup in particular could still be one that yields points. Dragons versus Raiders, again, another big one. Both teams on 28 points. Neither of these two teams are like attacking stalwarts, but, I think Raiders probably don't have as many relevant Supercoach players, but on the Dragons side of things, you're probably looking at a Lomax. You probably got him in last week if you really did want him. Look, he's still someone who's been a gun all season long, so, no issues if Lomax is your trade-in for this week. He ended up on 125 versus Parramatta. And then looking at the teams towards after the Raiders, none of those teams really have much to play for. Warriors are obviously on the bye this week, but Broncos season effectively over and versus the Melbourne Storm. Don't really see much prospect there. That means I really do like the Melbourne Storm in their matchup, coming off a week's rest for a lot of their star players as well. Titans, nothing to play for. Penrith looking to just come on, play their last regular season game at home and have a good performance. So I really like Penrith as a team to be targeting for this week. The likes of a Luai. Alamoti's a nice little pod if he's goal kicking, which he was goal kicking last week, so I wouldn't expect it to be any different. Rabbitohs, nothing to play for, so gives me confidence in the Roosters players, Teddy, Angus, etc. Eels, West Tigers. Now, obviously, both of these teams are down at the bottom, but they do have a lot to play for this week, which is to compete for not getting the wooden spoon. So hard to predict this game, to be honest. I don't know. I think the West Tigers, have shown a bit more attacking intent in the last few rounds. Eels obviously put on 44 points on the Dragons last week, and I think they've generally been a little bit better. So I look at this game as well thinking, there is potential to have a lot of points scored in this game. I don't think we can look at either of these two teams and think their defense is that crash hot. Eels letting in, 25 tries in the last 10 minutes against the Dragons, and Tigers have been pretty much the most leaky team all season long. Is that backed up by the stats in the ladder? Yep, they've conceded 690 points all season. That is more than any other team. Actually, funnily, I've just realized both the Eels and Tigers have conceded 690 points all season long. So the two worst defenses playing each other, competing for not winning the wooden spoon. Look, I'm definitely playing Dill Bags this week. Definitely playing Lockie Galvin, I think, as well. People are looking at a pod like Mike Acevo as well, who scored 100 plus last week. When you think about the matchup and what they're playing for, again, I don't particularly hate that as well. So just circling back now to the SuperCoach page and onto my team in a bit more detail. So I think we've kind of gone through a lot of those matchups in good detail, but to kind of summarize the teams that I'm liking to target this week for your kind of final week trade-ins: Melbourne, both of West Tigers, Parramatta, I think are good shouts. The Roosters, probably then Penrith, and then probably the Knights and Dolphins. Manly versus Sharks. Manly are playing at home, which is a benefit, but obviously no Tom Turbo, who's been ruled out for this week. But, you could still go for a pod, someone like a Cooler, who's been named at fullback. He potentially could be an option. But while it's at home, it's against the Sharks, who've been pretty good all season long. So I'm not really looking at that matchup thinking I can see like a 50-point pasting happening. That's kind of what you're really trying to predict, like who's going to be scoring 45 plus and, trying to get the most central players in those teams. So yeah, those are kind of the teams that I do like targeting this week, and most likely if I do, if whoever I trade in, that's kind of where I'm going to be leaning. So before getting into my players on my own team specifically, thought I'd have a quick look at top 10 trade ins and outs, and most of these trades do generally make sense. So a couple of the Warriors being sold, like Adam Fanul-Blake, obviously they're on the bye this week. Turbo to Ponga is the most popular trade so far. This is across all coaches. I can quickly show you how that looks as well in the top 1%. So in the top 1%, Turbo to Ponga is the most popular trade. So 43%. Basically, that suggests that 43% of Turbo owners are going to Ponga. So Ponga, I think, is the most traded in player this week. And what I'll do is I'll filter it by coaches in the top 5%. So we're kind of looking at a bit more of a more relevant, active player base, I guess. So Ponga is the number one most traded in player in this group. That makes complete sense. As I just mentioned, speaking about the matchup Knights versus Dolphins, I think there's a game with plenty of points in there. Ponga was really good last week, who I did end up captaining. Scored 118, goal kicking. He's got all the attributes, I think, to have another good game this week. Teddy, number 2. Look, Teddy and Ponga, for sure, for me, are the two best fullbacks, I think, to be getting into your teams this week. Now, someone did ask me, if you don't own one of these two guys and you're selling Turbo, which of the two would you be getting in? It's a really, really tough one to answer because, both of these guys, I think, very easily can go 120 plus last week. Teddy last week scored 104 points, really with only one major attacking stat, which was like a try assist. Otherwise, he was just taking a lot of runs. I think he had 50, 60 in base power. You can easily see him doing this against the Rabbitohs. I would still lean Ponga, though, I think, just because I think the goal kicking is nice, just gives him that little extra bonus on his scores. And yeah, I think playing at home, that probably does help as well. Teddy is playing away. I know it's not a big trip within Sydney, it's just going to a core stadium, but Rabbitohs, Roosters, despite wherever the Rabbitohs are ranking, there's always a bit of feeling in that game as well. So you just never quite know what could happen in that type of a game. Whereas Ponga, I think, at home goal kicking versus the Dolphins, both teams are a lot to play for, but as I said before, I think both teams mainly attacking, slightly edges Ponga for me. I guess one of the more popular other trade outs is Sam Walker. So he's the third most popular traded out player. Makes sense. And feel for Sammy, obviously getting that ACL. He's going to be out for 9 months. And as a Roosters fan, I'm sure many of you out there don't really care too much about the Roosters not being in a position to win a premiership because they're not very well liked. But I thought things were looking good this season. We hadn't really won against that many top teams. But yeah, Sam Walker being ruled out for the rest of the year. Brandon Smith as well. I kind of looked at it as I think that effectively ruins the chances of the Roosters winning the comp this year. Kind of makes it look like it's, again, a 2-horse race of Penrith or Melbourne. Anyway, putting my feelings aside, Sam Walker is obviously an easy person to sell if you've got the trade. And halfback is a good high upside position to target. One person did ask me, and probably another broader point around where do you actually make the trades in this type of a week. I do generally prefer the backs. If we look back to previous seasons, Cooler got 180 points, Cherry Evans got 150, and those really high-scoring games that they got at the end of last season. You're just less likely to get these huge scores from your second rowers or your front row, for example. Probably only really is Hooker, maybe, but even then specifically, that's probably Harry Grant. But it's really your halves, your fullbacks, and your centers where I think you're more likely going to be getting these big 100+ scores, and that's really what you're trying to chase this week. So I understand the reason why people are looking at moves at fullback with Turbo, and then Sam Walker is some of the more popular trades. If you're short in front row, though, for sure, Adam Finnell-Blake and Mitch Barnett being sold to Payne Haas or a Tarpany, that also makes complete sense for your team. But on kind of halfbacks in general, and who would we be looking at trading in? So for trade-ins, Jerome Hughes at the moment is the number one choice at the moment. And I think this is a really good option to trade in. So he obviously got a rest last week, but prior to that had scored 132 points. Against the Broncos. Melbourne actually have a really good record against the Broncos, and they do generally like playing up in Queensland at Suncorp. So I think Hughes, he's still shown he was generally quieter when Munster was back in the team, and we can kind of have a look at him just here. So he actually scored last time against the Broncos 108 points earlier this season, and yeah, obviously Hughes has been amazing all season long. There was this period from round 20 to round 24 where, the matchups were pretty good. Parramatta, Dragons, Rabbitohs, and he was kind of just scoring the 60s. That was kind of when Munster had come back into the team. But he had that huge game against the Dolphins at home, playing 100 and scoring 132 points. So we saw more of him going quieter rather than these big scores since Munster has been back in the team. But we do know he's got this ceiling, and he's been tremendous all season long. So I think he does make sense to me as kind of the most traded in halfback replacement for Sam Walker. I think, and that's really looking at Melbourne. At the moment in my own team, I actually don't have anyone from Melbourne apart from Eli Katoa. I sold Harry Grant last week to get a replacement hooker in Reece Robson. So having a piece of the Melbourne attack this week, I think is actually really good. I do prefer him to Munster. So a lot of people might have the duels to be able to get in a 5'8" like Munster, but I think we've seen with Munster really good last week, but that was when he didn't have a lot of those other guns like Grant or Hughes in the team. But when they were in the team, Munster's scores were lower. And I think it's more likely for Hughes or Grant to go big this week compared to Munster, just based on all of them being back and available. So Jerome Hughes, I think, is really good. He's definitely high on my shopping list this week for a halfback trade, and I can go Sam Walker to him very easily. So I really like him. Nico Hines is actually the other guy at number 7. So he had quite a game last week. I think he only ended up scoring about 47 points. I don't really love Nico Hines as a trade-in this week. I know that sounds crazy because we know the pedigree of the player, but I think we were seeing it. I don't even know if I mentioned it last week. Well, I probably did. I hope I did. But being named with Trindle, I think we've seen this season that when he plays with Trindle, Hines just isn't that humongous upside Supercoach player that we've seen at times during this year. At the beginning of the season, the scores were decent. They're very good. Don't get me wrong. 75, 53, 94, 82. But those were with Trindle in the team. And as soon as Trindle wasn't in that squad, 142, 160, 97, 114, which is the kind of score that you want to get in a week like this. But in the 4 weeks that he kind of came back from that, in the weeks leading up to his injury and then coming back last week, 68, 48, 68, 47, Trindle does have an effect on Hines. And I think an away matchup against Manly, who have got a lot to play for, it doesn't scream like a game where I'm afraid of Hines to go 150 plus. Obviously, it could bite me in the backside, but you know what? You got to play the probabilities, and my guess is that he won't have as big of a ceiling as someone like a Jerome Hughes this week. So I understand why people go for Hughes above Hines. If you already have Hughes, I understand that. If you already have Hughes, though, To be honest, it's probably Jerome Luai who I think I'd be looking at instead of Nico. So he's 556k. Obviously had a really quiet week the week before last, but last week kind of returned to form when we've seen him playing at halfback this year. What did he score? I think he scored about 82 points. 83, sorry. And he is in my team at the moment, so maybe I'm a little bit biased. But it's one of those teams that I think have a really good matchup at home to the Titans. Could be the best matchup this week in the entire round. A lot to play for Luai. He's on limited time now with Penrith. This will be his final regular season game for Penrith at home. He has gotten big scores over 100, plenty of 90s and 80s playing at halfback this year. I think him and Hines similar. I'd probably say Hines has got a better floor than Luai, but ceiling for this week, I think Luai I'd definitely prefer to Hines. I'd probably rank Hughes just a bit above Luai, but I reckon Hughes, Luai, and then Hines. I'd be ranking those three as replacements for Sam Walker or even Matt Burton, who I didn't mention as well, has actually been ruled out this week with that HIA. I can see Tyron Wishart has been named here. Obviously, he had a great game last week, but he has been named back on the bench, so obviously probably not a consideration for you now. So that's a little bit on the halves in terms of trade-ins for this week, and that's definitely where I'm looking at the moment, is maybe getting in a halfback. Being honest, I think my trades this week are either going to be in the halves, centers, not fullback, because I've already got Teddy and Ponga, which I'm pretty happy with. It will pretty much be in the halves or centers, I think, where I'm most likely going to be trading in this week. Having a quick look through, maybe we'll talk a little bit about front row. So I know people are looking at selling Fanul Blake and Mitch Barnett. You got Payne Haas, who had a good game last week. Yeah, so confirming that, Payne Haas hasn't been named this week. That's something I actually missed. So obviously, got to reverse those trades out. I think that probably does leave someone like Joe Tarpany as your best option at front row. Had a good game last week. I think he scored in the 60s. 69 points. He's just been getting actually some attacking stats in the last few rounds as well. As we saw before, a lot to play for. So if you've got the money and you can go AFB to Tarpany, he would definitely be the one I'd be leaning to at front row. If you are looking for a replacement, like he's been on a tear basically since like round 20, round 21. So Tarpany, I think with Payne Haas not being named, he's probably your natural, I think, replacement for Fanul Blake. Fanul Blake 695k. Hopefully you've got about 15-20k to make that trade. If you didn't, that probably does leave your options a little bit short. We can have a quick look at front rowers outside of Joe Tarpany that you could maybe look to. Terrell May probably does stand out. So he's 503k, scored 86 points last week. I believe the bench is pretty favourable for him this week for the Roosters as well. Can get attacking stats. We've seen this in the past. Terrell May is probably the natural replacement, I think, if you don't have the money for Joe Tarpany, but you are looking for a front rower this week. But naturally, I'd say avoid having to make the trade at front row if you can, just because it's a fairly low upside position. And I think you're better off making trades elsewhere in your backs or maybe at, say, your hooker spot. So that's probably a little bit on front row, probably not too much to touch on there. Other notable outs for this week, Fafita, Pappy has been ruled out as well. That does actually open up Suafar-Longo as a bit of an interesting centre wing pod. So I might actually start a little bit more discussion around some of these centre wingers, because I think that is a very useful place to be looking at for high upside guys to be trading in for this week. So just sorting by centres. So, who would have predicted that Herbie Farnworth would be the third highest averaging centre for this season? But he's had so many big scores. He had 50 in base alone last week, but obviously scored a double. I think he had 2 try assists, like a huge score of 176. And he's just been doing it pretty much, I wouldn't say all season, but pretty much from round 10. He has been like an awesome pod for owners. So like low scores of 44. So like even if you got him in this week as a bit of a pod, if you look at the screen there, I think his own, I haven't got it up, but he's 5.6% of selected teams. So very, very low owned. So definitely meets the definition of a pod for this week. But, 121, 88, 104, 133, 176. He has got like 4 tons already this season. And I'd say apart from the 104, those other ones are fairly big tons. I consider anything over 120, a pretty big score over 100. So he's got that in his locker for sure. And I don't think the Knights are the strongest defensive team that we've ever seen. The only downside, I guess, with him is price. He's 776k now. So if you've got the ability to maybe fit him into your team, I really like him as a pod. But I do appreciate that he's probably going to be quite expensive for a lot of people out there. So I like him a lot as a centre wing pod option, but probably he's going to be a little bit difficult to fit in. Suafa'alongo, we'll quickly touch on him. So of course he's been named this week at fullback, which I really do like. So we'll quickly filter for Melbourne just so we can get him. You've probably got Nick Meaney and Suafa'alongo. My issue, I guess, with Nick Meaney is that even in that big game that the Melbourne Storm won, I think a couple of weeks ago versus the Dolphins, he just didn't really get much of the ball. And playing, Katoa gets more of the ball, I think, on the right. And, you would think that being the goal kicker for this really attacking Melbourne team, his high score this season is 108, which you could get this week, which you'd obviously be very happy with. But it just seems as though he's not really going to be the guy who I think delivers a big 130 for you this week, even if Melbourne do towel up the Broncos. Apologies, Broncos fans. You probably are looking at someone who's a bit more on the eye test anyway, exciting. That's probably Suafa'alongo. Now, he does have very low base. He does need a lot of attacking stats to get his good scores, but he has got a score of 90, 89, and 81 so far this year. He does appeal a little bit more to me playing at fullback compared to playing in the centres like Nick Meaney. So I think if you are looking for Melbourne Storm centres, Fa'alongo is definitely where I'd be leaning instead of Nick Meaney. I do feel though, because of his very low base, and I think, yes, he's the fullback, but I don't think the fullback for Melbourne necessarily is the focal point of the attack for that particular team. And so again, I'm looking at it as Melbourne could score a lot of points, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the fullback is going to go huge. Now, Pappy obviously went 114 when when the Melbourne Storm beat up the Dolphins. So he could be an option, but I think of someone like a Micah Sivo instead. So I know Sivo is the same, where he's got extremely low base and he could literally get you a score of 10. But when I think of focal point of an attack, we know that the Eels do love going down their left-hand side. And he's been on a good run in the last few weeks as well. So just having a quick look here. 135 last week, and 3-round average of 64, 5-round of 59, sorry. So to be honest, I'm probably overstating the run he's been on a little bit, because it's really only, this is the thing. He can get you 7 and then 135. He has got 112 earlier this year. He is the definition of rocks and diamonds. So he's only in 1%. He's in 893 teams. So he is an uber pod. He's probably a bigger pod than Herbie Farnworth or Suafa'alongo. So I think Micah Sivo, he's at a more budget price at 523k, and I'm kind of considering him, versus the West Tigers, because we've seen before that the West Tigers equal with Parramatta, worst defensive teams in the competition. So I do like Sivo potentially as a bit of a pod. Looking at these stats a little bit more, I probably do think Fa'alongo, I'd lean a little bit, I think, more than Sivo. Even though I just said all that stuff about Fa'alongo not being the focal point, I do generally prefer a fullback than maybe a winger. So while Sivo has got these really big games, scoring 135 last week versus the Dragons, even if he scores 2 tries, he still can maybe get you a 70. Fa'alongo, 2 tries, maybe gets you an 80, 90, but I think potential could be higher just playing at fullback. Again, I'm thinking a little bit back to last year. The reason that Talatau Koula got his huge scores was him playing at fullback, because playing at fullback, you can just swing both sides of the field. That actually does make me think a little bit about Hamiso Tabuai-Fidow as well. So I'll quickly go back to the Dolphins, because we spoke a little bit about Herbie, but didn't really speak much about the Hammer. So 101 points last week, and he's been pretty good all season long. He's much more affordable. He's 521k. So I do think if you're interested in the Dolphins attack, but you couldn't afford Herbie, Hammer is probably the way that I'd be going. Just knowing that, again, playing at fullback, I do generally like that for your center wingers. And he was having really good scores at the beginning of the year when he had easy matchups. 94 versus Dragons, 112 Titans, 94 versus the West Tigers. Did get 123 versus Penrith, but that was an understrength Penrith team, just after Origin. And then 101 versus the Broncos, who pretty much have kind of thrown in the towel, basically. So Knights, you could argue is a good matchup. Kind of making my decision on Hamiso versus Fa'alongo. I'm not 100% sure. Because I'm a little bit unsure of this, it's making me lean a little bit maybe towards just getting a halfback like Jerome Hughes, and I'll get on to my team in a little bit. Other pods that I do like, so thinking about some of those other teams that we think are going to do really well this week, Penrith comes to mind. So let's quickly jump to Penrith and see if there's any nice little pod plays that we can look at there. and focusing mainly on centre wing. So even like I'll quickly touch on Dylan Edwards. So Dylan Edwards has been named, but I think if you're not getting if Edwards does end up playing, I think you're not going to be selling the likes of a Teddy or a Ponga. But if there's an instance where Dane Laurie comes into that team and Edwards gets a rest, I'll be very, very interested in Laurie, because we've seen Laurie when he gets a starting gig in 5'8" or fullback for Penrith this year. He's been awesome. But the most notable, I guess, kind of pods you can probably look at here are Brian To'o, Paul Alamotti, and Sunia Turuva. Alamotti really does stick out because he's got the goal kicking. So 111 points last week versus the who did they verse? They versed the Rabbitohs? I think it was the Rabbitohs, didn't they? Yes, 111 points versus the Rabbitohs. But, he's had some decent scores in him. 96 versus the Dragons in round 13. 67 versus the Sharks. 72, 74. Like, he's got decent base about him as well. So, if I quickly look at fantasy, like, he scored quite a few tries as well this year. But, even looking at last week, obviously the 20 points in goal kicks really does boost up his score a lot. But no try, scoring 111, that's pretty good. 9 points in tackles, 10 points in tackle bust, we're looking at 19, 12 points in offloads, that's 31, plus 34 in base. So 31 plus 34, we're looking at 65 base power. So last week was a huge workload game for Paul Alamotti. Do you really think it's going to be any different versus the Titans? Probably not. The only thing that we saw last week versus the Titans was the Knights were definitely going and favouring down their right-hand side more. So maybe you think, does the right-hand side of the Penrith Panthers benefit more versus Alamotti on the left? But only 2 weeks ago, we saw the Roosters left edge carve up the Titans. So I think it really depends on the day, kind of thing. Toto at 610k, he's at a much more affordable price now. But honestly, just because of the uncertainty about playing on which wing they play on and things, and which edge is going to get more ball, I'm actually not that keen on Toto. I think, look at that 3-round average of 41. Yes, he could spike a huge 170, but I think, Toto is still higher owned than someone like an Alamotti. So having a look at it here in summary, so Toto is in 12% of teams. If you compare that to Alamotti, just 1%. So definitely much more of a pod, and his goal kicking. I do actually think I prefer Alamotti. I know playing at centre, I generally do prefer the wingers, but Alamotti, actually, I've really got an eye on him as a centre wing trade-in, because I think Penrith have got the best potential to really pile on the points this week. And if he's the goal kicker, he can easily add 20 to 30 points potentially on his score just purely from goal kicking, which we saw last week. So there's a few kind of pods that we've obviously, that's not an exhaustive list of pods to go for from in the centres or even just centres in general. But we kind of spoke a little bit about Herbie, Hamiso, Sevo, Alamotti, who else we talked about? I can't even remember who we talked about. Dan Gagai could also be a shout. He scored 74 last week. I think if you can afford it, Herbie is my preferred, because I think we've seen out of those guys who I just listed, he's got the highest floor, like he based 50 last week, but he's probably shown he's got highest ceiling as well. So Farnworth, I think if you can afford, he would actually be my number one, even though he's like 6% owned, so it's not like he's not as low owned as those others. I still think he's got the highest potential. Alamotti would probably be my second, I reckon. Just with the goal kicking and Penrith, I really think he's got good attributes for him. I'd probably would then go making my mind up on the spot. I reckon Hamiso, then Farlongo, and then I think Mike Acevo. That's kind of my 5, I think, pod centers that you can opt for this week. And I think those would be my rankings of those guys. So all of those guys are from teams I think have got potential to score really big points for this week. So we've kind of covered off the halves. We've covered off a little bit on 5'8", a bit of front row. Second row, if you are selling a Fafita, there's probably not too many pods really out there. So Fafita is, I think it was the 5th or 6th most traded out player. You're probably looking for your standard guys, to be honest. Like if you don't have Angus, Eli Katoa, probably should actually give a shout out Zayo. He's just been so good all season long, and I think he's kind of just really not been selected, or at least discussed by myself, because he's kind of steady first half of the season, averaging around 70, and you're like, sweet, he's doing really well, but he's not hurting me. And then he goes into Origin, then he comes out of Origin, and then you're concerned about, is he going to get rested, all that kind of stuff. Long story short, we all pretty much missed him. I say we all because I don't think he's very highly owned. He is, well, good on you for good on 20% of you. I thought he was going to be like 10% owned. Look, he's not low owned. It's just me who's missed out on him. Maybe that explains my ranking. But I think if you are going for a second row, to be honest, actually, I think I would go Isaiah Yeo. He's got a 3-round average of 103, 5-round average of 87. I believe he's got the highest 5-round average out of any second rower. I think he would definitely be the second rower I would be replacing Fafita with. Britton Nickera, tough matchup against Manly away. Eli Katoa is probably the second best, just with Broncos away. Really good matchup, I think. And then Angus versus the Rabbitohs. I think, coming up against his old team in the rivalry. But Isaiah is probably the guy who I'd be leaning towards, I think, if you are looking for a second rower. So, obviously, haven't covered off probably like all of your questions and things, and maybe not all your sit starts, but do hit me up on socials and stuff. Conscious that the video has been going for about 31 minutes and haven't had dinner yet. So, I'll quickly touch on my team and what I'm looking at doing for this week. So, as I've mentioned a couple of times, I'm probably not looking to be doing any trades in my front half of the team. So, I think I'll be looking at doing trades more in my halves or my backs. So I've got Josh Curran and I've got Samuel Lafinu. Curran has been named on the bench, but he's kind of generally safe for a 50. Samuel Lafinu, I could potentially go and punt on him this week just because he might be running at a weak Parramatta edge. So that's probably a decision for me. But he has sometimes burnt me when I have when I haven't played him, because he kind of can go and get these 25s and 40s. But at the same time, he has got some try scoring ability in him. 112 versus Cowboys. Got that very, very late try against Manly as well to score 86 points. So, thinking about it, I'm leaning towards actually playing Samuel Lafinu now just because of the matchup, I think. Again, thinking of points, whatnot, I think Samuel Lafinu probably has a better potential than Josh Curran this week. And look, if I get the decision wrong, I expect Curran more likely to score 20 to 25 points more. So, it's not a huge... maybe it's not a huge gamble to play Samuel Lafinu and try to chance that attacking upside. Second rows, I don't think I'm going to be making any trades here. I've got Fafita, but I've got Olukwatu, I've got Angus, and I've got Eli Katoa. I think those are all completely fine. Angus and Katoa for sure are going to be playing for me. The only decision will be Britton Nickera or Olukwatu. I think playing at home, I think Olukwatu got that sin. Did he get a sin bin? But he only scored 58 points last week, and I think he could have scored much more than that. So I think Olukwatu is probably the guy who I'm leaning towards at the moment. Moving on to my halves, so I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. So moving on to my halves, Dillbags. Yeah, look, I'm not. Look, I didn't do my Sunday stream last week, not because I wanted to avoid talking about it, but yeah, sitting Dylan Brown when I've probably been one of his biggest supporters. Look, if you've been watching me for a few years, you guys know how much I like having Dylan Brown on my SuperCoach team. I've stuck with him all season long, never traded him. He was a little bit disappointing. I had a good squad on paper. I played Marzu over him because Marzu at the Titans. I thought, Dragons, top 8 team. Surely they can't be that bad. And then he goes and puts 162 on the Dragons' head, and I've sat him, and I'm just watching it, and I'm just like, oh, you idiot. Me being the idiot, not Dillbags. So, yeah, Dylan, that really did hurt. I've been one of your biggest supporters over the last few years, and to come out and do that to me when I sat you was not cool. But anyway, you are definitely getting a run out this week, that is for sure. So at the moment he's got the VC, so actually that reminds me, I'll talk about captaincy after I talk about my team. But yeah, Dillbags definitely playing. I think Galvin and Luai for sure Luai. Galvin could maybe still be a decision as to whether I play him or not, but he's been so good all season long. I think I will end up playing him. So probably will have to take the reserve off one of my centers. So at the moment I got Val. I think coming up against the Bulldogs. Bulldogs have been very good defensively, but Val is generally safe for like a 55 to 60, and we know he's got a really big ceiling on him. So I think I'm probably still going to be playing Val. Definitely playing Lomax. I think playing at home, he's been so good all season long. Karaz up against the Cowboys. He's been a little bit quiet. He's been named at center last week, but he's still safe for 50s, and we know that he's got big scores in him. And Cowboys, I don't think, are the strongest defense. Dom Young, he's been a little bit disappointing the last couple of weeks, being very honest, but I think he's just one of those guys who can absolutely go huge. So you have to play him, I think, versus the Rabbitohs. Then the others that I've got are Kale Iro, Ruben Garrick, and Marzu. Marzu was 39 points without any attacking stats is fine. I know I've spoken a lot about the Knights and their potential to score points, but I think Fletcher Sharp has been such a magnet for them in the last few weeks. It's really, and same as Dan Gagai, it's really starved Marzu of any good ball. So and after being burnt last week, look, it could be flipped this week where Marzu goes big and Dillbags doesn't, but I just don't think I can watch another game of the Knights and have Marzu catching a cold out there. So I think he'll be sitting for me. Manly versus Sharks. So I've got Iro and Garrick in this one. Pretty confident I will be playing Garrick. Just we saw his ceiling last week. I think the goal kicking, playing at home, I think I'm very comfortable playing him. So it'll be a decision probably on Iro. And do I play him? Also, I literally just realized Kale Iro is 732k. Surely it's between him and Galvin, I think, for best cheapie of the season. But if we're going to give out an award, Iro has made 512k, Galvin 451k. Look, we have one more week to make the decision, but I think Kale Iro averaging 66, and we picked him up at 219k. He's probably going to be the best cheapie of the season, I think. And we didn't have him from round one, but he's been insane since we've ever picked him up. So, Iro has been really, really good in the last few weeks. And, he scored tries pretty much in, every game in the last 3-4 rounds, I want to say. Yeah, he's got 1, 2, 3, 4. He's got 5 tries in his last 6. So he's been on a bit of a scoring streak, but Manly is a bit of a tougher opponent. So I'm thinking he could potentially be a sit this week. It's a bit scary knowing how good of his scores have been in the last few weeks, but the trade that I'm thinking of doing means I'll need to make a decision on who to sit for this week, and it'll probably be potentially dropping. It's weird. I'll have to drop one of Val, Carraz, or Iro. I think the others, and Marzu's not even getting a look in. Sorry, Greg. But yeah, in terms of my trade and what I'm thinking of doing this week, so I've got 45k in the bank. So I think the two that I'm leaning towards, I could do Iro to Herbie Farnworth. Call it points chasing. Leaves me with $1,500 in the bank, which it feels nice at the end of the season to be just sitting there with not very much money left in the bank, so you haven't wasted it. Herbie's just been on an absolute tear, and he's a bit of a pod. So I can afford Iro to Farnworth. So that's option number 1. Option number 2, I can do Iro to Alamotti, or I can just do Greg to Alamotti. It doesn't really make a difference. I can afford either in either situation. But that's also a trade that I can do. So Alamotti in for Marzu. That would give me more of a benching headache, because then I'll be looking at, it'll give me the same benching headache. The benefit of doing the Iro to Farnworth trade is that it gives me no benching headache, because then I'm just sweet, I'm stuck with the reserves that I've got. So that's option 2, potentially. Iro or Marzu in for Alamotti. Third option that I'm leaning is Sam Walker out, so he's obviously out, so he's one I can easily trade. I can bring in Nico Hines, but as I said before, already got Luai, so I think Jerome Hughes would be the way that I'd be leaning. A couple of people did mention about maybe getting in a Cam Munster, who obviously scored well last week, but I do feel like Munster is not going to have as big of a game as Jerome Hughes would, just given based on what we've seen this season so far when they've all been playing together. So I think I'd be leaning Hughes for sure over Munster. So I can do that as well. And that leaves me with only 3.4k in the bank again, so that feels nice too. And I'd have to take the reserve. I'd probably take the reserve off Iro, I think, at this point, and put it on to Hughes. And Hughes, at that point, probably would be my VC, because he plays the very first game of the round. So those are my 3 options. I've got Iro to Farnworth, Iro/Marzu to Alamotti, or Sam Walker to Jerome Hughes. That's kind of the 3 trades I'm leaning at the moment. I don't really have a strong view on which one of the ones I would be doing, but I'll obviously post my final team as we get closer to lockout on Thursday. But yeah, that's kind of where my head's at with my trades. So as you can tell, all focused in on the backs. In terms of captaincy, just to quickly touch on that. So it's fairly not obvious, but there are a couple of good matchups to target here. The fullbacks definitely stand out. So you've got Teddy versus the Rabbitohs, and then you've got Ponga versus the Dolphins. So at the moment, I've just got the captaincy on Teddy, just because he's been so good all season long. He's got a season average of 91.8, and that includes a score of 4 points. I'm sure if I took that out, his average would be probably closer to about 94, 95, which is incredible considering how, me included, a lot of us were writing him off at the beginning of the year, but he's just been absolutely amazing this year. Ponga's there as well as a potential captaincy consideration, so we need to make a decision on one of the two. I ended up going Ponga last week. I think playing at home could make me sway again to KP. Again, thinking of like, percentages, who's the one who I think is who's the one who's lower captain, maybe swing for the fences type thing. So those two definitely stand out. If you're really going kind of hell for leather, Jerome Luai, Alamotti could be options. Penrith versus the Titans. Also probably looking at the Melbourne boys. So Melbourne versus the Broncos. I think Jerome, they're probably your VC candidates. I think Harry Grant, Jerome Hughes are probably the two best VCs. Maybe got Eli Katoa, but I think you're probably looking at those other two. I think they're more likely to go bigger. West Tigers, Parramatta, Dillbags. If you've got a Mike Acevo, throw a VC on him. Lockie Galvin could be a VC, but we've probably seen not enough huge 100-plus point scores, I think, to justify a VC on him. But I think a VC Hughes feels good. And then, captaincy probably on one of your fullbacks. Lomax also stands out just because he's been really solid all season long. We'll take a quick look at captaincy percentages. So if you are thinking about maybe KP versus Teddy, you might be making your decision based on ownership numbers. So if you go ranked in the top 5%, at the moment the top VC is Val Holmes. I have a feeling that's maybe a bit of a hangover from last week because last week he was the most popular VC. So maybe a lot of teams haven't updated yet. But I wouldn't think to VC Val, I think, against the Dogs. So Jerome Hughes probably the most... Lomax or Jerome Hughes probably the most realistic. This makes me think that Jerome Hughes could be a very good vice captaincy shout, as is Dillbags. If we look at captaincy, so at the moment the masses are going with Teddy, which is fairly understandable. 54% in the top 5% of coaches are captaining Teddy. Ponga's next up at 27%. So you can see that it's really congested in these two guys. So I think probably comes down to how you may be going after the first couple of games. And I think if you're just trying to swing for the fences, you know what? Personally, I'm actually still leaning a little bit towards Teddy. Like Ponga scored a double last week and goal kicked and got 118. Teddy had like one try assist and scored 104. He's just in that kind of form where like it's so hard to doubt him not going at least 100 and 110 plus. Like he just feels much safer. Ponga could maybe throw in like a 70 or 80. But if I look at last week, 104 points with one try assist and a couple of line break assists, but otherwise, a couple of line breaks, 34 points in runs, 20 points in tackle busts. Like he was just bouncing around the field. So I'd probably still lean Teddy just about over KP at the moment. Your pod, and then from there, you've got a bunch of other pod captains like Lomax. Dom Young could be, but I think Dom Young, the fact that he's gone low in the last couple of weeks, and probably the only thing to maybe consider with the Roosters actually, with Sam Walker being out, the attack could flounder a little bit. So KP could be a really good shout in that sense. So one probably I'll have to sit on a little bit. At the moment it's on Teddy, but I have to maybe think a bit more about the whole Sam Walker impact on the Roosters. If you ask me lockout in 2 minutes I had to choose, I'd probably stick with Teddy. Anyway guys, that is probably going to wrap up the video, 40 to 45 minutes, so still been going on for quite a while, but just a few thoughts around some good trade-ins for this week, my own team and whatnot. But thank you everyone for tuning in. It's been an awesome season and I really appreciate all the support that we've had in the last 12 months doing this for not 12 months, but you know what I mean, since the 2024 season has commenced, whatever. Really appreciate all the support that you guys have shown. Hopefully get the internet sorted. We'll look to do a final Sunday wrap-up stream. On Sunday we'll talk through my final rank, hopefully what I know, a decent idea of what that's going to be, and lessons learned and that kind of stuff like that. So hopefully see you all on Sunday for the live stream. If not, please do give the video a like, do subscribe as well so that you get at least a Sunday stream notification and next year's videos. But until then, see you all in the next one.